Okay, brilliant. Hello, everyone. My name's Nathan Lawson, and I'm the president of the Oxford Climate Society and an undergraduate studying geography at the University of Oxford. I'm excited to introduce to you all our new Net Zero Homeschool series, which is a week-long webinar series aimed at school strikers, university students, and more broadly, anyone who's interested in tackling climate change and who wants to learn more about achieving net zero. The idea for this series came from Miles Allen, who's a professor of geosystem science and head of the climate dynamics groups at the Department of Physics at the University of Oxford. He's also our senior member and will be speaking in our last event on Friday. This series is in collaboration with The Guardian and also Climate Networks Foundation and the Oxford Climate Research Network. So just to add some context to the series, on June the 27th, 2019, which is, as you're aware, almost a year ago to the day, the UK became the first major economy to pass laws to end the contribution to global warming by 2050. Achieving net zero will be one of the defining challenges of our time. This webinar series, which is delivered by world-leading climate experts, aims to empower Generation Net Zero with a deeper understanding of what net zero means and what it will take to achieve both for the UK and the world. So just to say a little bit more about us at the Oxford Climate Society, we're one of the largest student-led societies within the university. We aim to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders through our educational weekly events. We've run events in the past with world-leading climate experts such as Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland and United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, George Monbiot, who's a profound author and environmental columnist at The Guardian, and Jim Ski, who's the co-chair of Working Group 3 for the IPCC. We also run educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change seminar program, which will actually be accessible to anyone in the new academic year. We're producing it in an online format. In addition, we also run the world's largest student-led climate journal, which is called The Anthroposphere. And over the longer term, we are working with the university to develop net zero policies and also incorporate climate change into the Oxford curriculum. So before we start the event today, I want to pass over to Kaya Axelson, who's the Vice President at the Student Union, to talk a little bit about the net zero scene within Oxford and some of the activities that have been going on in the recent months and years. So Kaya, if I could hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and a big kudos to the Oxford Climate Society, who have just been a force of nature in Oxford. Over the past few years, the Oxford Climate Society has put on more events than I think I can count, and educated people on everything to do with climate. This year in particular, Oxford Climate Society and many other student groups banded together to create a climate action plan in Oxford. And we were so thrilled to see the university take this up. And this is privileged information straight from us before it's been announced. The University of Oxford will be announcing a net zero target of its own. So we got to work thinking, what does net zero mean? What can we do to contribute to it? And this is part of the result of that effort. Part of the reason as well for hosting this series is I've been to so many protests, so many young people are passionately involved with the climate crisis now. And what I always hear at the end of these events is, well, what can you do to do your bit on climate change? So often the response turns the onus of fighting climate change back onto students. Go vegetarian, ride your bike more. But what we know is, in addition to all that behavior change that is really becoming a cultural shift in our society, thanks to young people, we also need institutional change. And we need young people to be skilled up to say what type of institutional change and what does that mean. So that's what this series is all about, skilling you up to demand of your leaders what they need to do to facilitate the transition to the next stage. In addition to our call to the university to go net zero well before 2050, the University of Oxford has also succeeded in divesting from fossil fuels. with a special condition that all of our investments across our portfolio will need to be net zero as well for us to continue investing in the long term. In addition, our career service has led on net zero ambition as well. In surveying every one of its employers, students said for a long time, we don't want to work for organizations that aren't prepared for our future. So we've surveyed every single one of our potential employers at the career service to ask them to go net zero. And in addition to that, at the start of the year, we kicked it off with student protests. Students who were even considering coming to Oxford in the first place occupied open days, laid on the floor and said, we're not going to attend Oxford unless Oxford has a climate plan. And they did this across universities in the UK. So we're really seeing the power of student voice calling on institutions to go net zero. And it's important that we continue to be at the table for those discussions, knowing what that means, what's the science, what's the policy, and how do we get there. So we're so pleased that Oxford has been able to pair up with The Guardian. And it's my privilege now to hand over the microphone to Fiona Harvey, who is an esteemed and award-winning environmental columnist at The Guardian. Thank you so much for co-hosting this series with us, and we hope that it'll be a great experience for everyone.
Brilliant, thank you. And just before, one bit of housekeeping, just before we pass over to Fiona to start the first event, is so there's also the opportunity to ask questions directly to our speakers. So if you could just comment them in the YouTube live stream chat box, along with your first name and also where you're from, then we can get a better idea of who's listening. And yeah, brilliant. We're ready to start. So Fiona, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Fiona Harvey. I'm the environment correspondent at The Guardian. I've been environment correspondent since 2004, so quite a lot of environment since then. And there's been a lot of talk about net zero in the past year since the government adopted it as its target, net zero emissions by 2050. It has the advantage of being a nice round number, a nice round target. But what does it really mean? It's quite difficult to discern sometimes what that might mean in practice, what it means for individuals, what it means for businesses, what it means in terms of policy, and so on, even whether it is the right target. All of those are discussions that are incredibly important, and yet a lot of it that seems to have been missed out in the past year. And in fact, some would say that we've wasted the past year in terms of looking to a net zero target, and we need to be doing a lot more. We need to be moving on a lot faster. So we'll be finding out a lot more about that, about the nature of the target, what it actually entails and how we get there. But also we'll be looking at some of the, not just the scientific issues and why we have a net zero target and what that means for climate change. But also today we'll be looking as well at some of the legal and ethical issues that are involved in that. So that's what we've got lined up, and you will have a chance to ask your own questions at the end of it. And of course, this is just the first in a week-long series, as you've heard. So there will be other opportunities to explore deeper questions on some of the other aspects of net zero later in the week. So don't feel you have to ask all your questions now. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is David Frame, who is the director of the New Zealand Climate Change Research Institute. He's at the Victoria University of Wellington, and he's also spent quite a lot of time in Oxford, where he worked in the departments of physics and geography, and at the Smith School of Environment and the Environment, or the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. He's got policy experience as well, having worked for the New Zealand Treasury, and he's been a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, David, I think you're going to talk to us about the science of net zero. We're asking what it will take to end our contributions to global warming.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'm going to talk about is just a couple of quick points on, hang on, here we are, on ending the contribution to warming. So the 2 points I really want to cover are how net zero came to be a thing scientifically, how we came to start talking this way, and how to interpret what net zero exactly means. So it's really about how we finish the climate change problem, really why this makes sense as a very long-term goal. So if you go back 20 years or more, you find that people used to talk in terms of stabilization of the climate and the equilibrium climate conditions. And this is partly for reasons to do with how early the scientists early in this process of thinking about climate change in the modern era framed the problem. There were some technical reasons as to why this equilibrium and stabilization discourse was dominant, but also partly because of the goal, the ultimate aim of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So people used to talk all the time about stabilization and equilibria. And if you go back to the second assessment report, that focused on pathways to carbon dioxide stabilization. And if we just take the lowest of these, the one that is if climate sensitivity is somewhere in the vicinity of 3 degrees, then 450 parts per million would imply 2 degrees of warming. That's just how the maths work out. So that would be that that curve, which I've sort of highlighted in yellow there. And then working out a compatible emissions pathway that fits with that. So the top panel is concentrations of carbon dioxide. The bottom panel is the emissions that are consistent with that. But if we look at 2100, what we see is that it's actually quite early in this plot, and by 2100 there was still a lot of emissions that were thought to be consistent with that 450 parts per million target or 2 degree target, and models of that era of the 90s, 80s and 90s, but especially the 90s and even the early 2000s suggested that global emissions in 2100 could be around 2.6 gigatons of carbon per year. That's carbon emitted as carbon dioxide, and that's around a little over 25% of today's emissions. So the dominant framing in terms of emissions reduction was here's an example. There were several variations on this. This was one that originated in Britain, which was became quite a powerful way of framing the issue. And this was the contraction and convergence model. And the idea here is that all these countries. Can you see the mouse on this Zoom or should I? So the pink color, for instance, at the bottom there is the OECD, most of the rich countries. The blue color is is America's share under this way of partitioning emissions. The green band is China. The yellow band is India, and the sort of beige color is the rest of the world. And the thinking on contraction and convergence was that everybody would end up peaking their emissions at different times and then bringing them back down so that everybody ended up with pretty much equal per capita emissions in 2100. And there was a lot of discussion about this. It seemed a fairly fair way of doing things. You know, there's a lot of argument about that. You can argue about what fairness looks like, but this was a very common way of describing the problem. And again, the emissions in 2100 were around that 2.6 gigatons of carbon emitted as CO2 level. And then things began to change in the 2000s. And I guess this is sort of where Miles and I got involved as well in this particular conversation. So in the 2000s, carbon cycle researchers showed that CO2 was effectively a stock pollutant. And I'll talk you through exactly what I mean by stock and flow pollutants in a little bit. But what it really means, a stock pollutant is persistent in the environment. So it hangs around. And around 40 kilograms of a kilogram of around 40% of a kilogram of CO2 emitted today is still in the atmosphere in 1,000 years. So it's a substantial fraction of what comes out of your tailpipe of your car will be around for a very long time. And also, this is the bit that Miles and I were heavily involved in. Climate researchers kept failing to pin down the equilibrium climate sensitivity, and that meant it was hard to say what a safe stabilization level was. And the real thing that changed in the mid to late 2000s was that together, what this actually implied was that there was a more or less linear response to the total emissions of CO2. And Miles and I first became aware of this actually on the way down to a conference called Stabilization 2005 in Exeter, where we did the plots on the train, which was quite good fun, and then presented this something along the lines of this cumulative framework, but our carbon cycle model wasn't quite good enough to write it up at that point. But subsequent developments, there were a series of papers, and they led to this appearing in and that was in 2005. We published in 2009, and then in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change showed this slide. So in this one, you have the historical emissions are in the black. Each decade is the little ball. These are slides actually taken from the official IPCC presentation after the 5th assessment report. So as we're moving to the right, we're emitting more CO2, and the temperatures are going up. And what this line of work led to was the realization that there was pretty much a linear response between the total human contribution to the atmosphere in terms of CO2 and the warming above pre-industrial levels. So cumulative emissions of CO2 largely determine global mean surface warming. And we think that relationship holds some way out. It may break down at high levels of warming or high levels of cumulative CO2 because of unanticipated feedbacks in the climate system. And so what this implies is that climate change is actually, there's just an uncertainty fan. Limiting climate change will require substantial and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. But what this implies is if you want to stop the warming, you have to actually stop the emissions of fossil carbon. So in this plot, it's kind of like a braking problem. As you're moving out up to the right, you're trying to slow that down so that you stop emitting that fossil carbon, emitting that CO2 into the atmosphere, because it's only by stopping the cumulative emissions of carbon that you actually stop the temperatures going up. And so this was actually quite a simplification. And these are different scenarios showing that if you do stop it in the dark blue in RCP 2.6 in the jargon, then you probably stay under 2 degrees. And if you haven't quite stopped it by 2100, stopped the fossil carbon into the atmosphere, then you're probably going to get somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees. And if you accelerate it as per RCP 8.5, then you're going to have no show of stopping it whatsoever. So this was actually a simplification of the problem, because instead of talking about equilibria and these complicated stabilization things, what we were able to talk about is stopping the emission, ultimately stopping CO2 emissions. And that is where net zero comes from, is that you need to get to net zero further emissions of CO2 to halt the warming. And the nice thing about this is it doesn't really matter when you the details of your emissions profile don't really matter over time, whether you peak this year or the next year or the year after that, or as long as you come down, it's the cumulative, it's the area under the curves on the left. They're all the same area under the curves, and then they give you more or less very, very similar warmings on the right. So all those three curves, the green, the blue, and the yellow, they have different peak years, they have different peak amounts, but they all have the same area under them. And then on the right, you can see the warming over time, and you can see that they all bunch up in the warming. So basically, all those scenarios that have the same area under the curve, that is cumulative emissions of CO2, have the same warming associated with them, certainly within uncertainty and within natural variability. So this is actually a simplification of the problem.
Just to be clear there, so if I could just break in there and say, well, So that means that you can peak later, but if you peak later, you have to bring the emissions down more sharply. Is that true?
Yes, so that's great. Thanks, Fiona. Yes, this is a physical point. So this is, if you went higher and peaked later, then you would have to bring them down to get the same level of warming. Now, I think every analysis that's been done suggests that peaking earlier and having a shallower rate of decline is much cheaper. So these are physically equivalent, but they are not economically equivalent. Following the green scenario would be a lot cheaper than following the orange scenario.
Because you might think, someone might think from looking at that, oh great, well we still don't have to worry about it for another 10 or 20 years or something. We'll still have time at that point to fix this. But that would be a misinterpretation.
Yes, and that was exactly, so this is really similar to a plot Miles and I led a piece in 2009. This is a really similar plot to one of the figures in that paper. And that was exactly the response we had from a lot of people who rather like burning fossil fuels, is that they said, oh great, we can just leave it for a bit longer. And then you'd point out, well, that means you've got to come down at minus 10% per annum in a few years' time. And then they realized that wasn't quite such a good game. So I think it is important to keep it clear that the green scenarios are much cheaper than the orange scenarios here. But physically, the Mother Nature doesn't particularly care, but obviously taxpayers do. And the contributions to climate change. Here's a nice plot from Carsten Halstein at the ECI. Keeps this global warming index going. The little dots on this, the little black dots, are monthly observations of the global climate, and the orange line is the best assessment of the human-induced warming. So the total warming that people have contributed over since 1850, and then the dark grey band is the cumulative CO2 emissions contribution. So that's what fossil carbon is driving, mainly fossil carbon, but CO2 contributions. And then the other climate drivers, so all those things like F gases and SF6 and methane and nitrous oxide and so on, are in the light grey band. And what you can see here is that the anthropogenic component, the human component, is dominated and increasingly dominated by the cumulative CO2 emissions. So that's the main thing we need to get under control. And in fact, you can turn this into a very simple equation that delta T, the orange line we had in the previous one, equals a constant times the cumulative emissions of CO2, the dark band we had, plus the other forcings contribution, which was that light grey band, divided by a number that's remarkably close to 1. So you can actually partition that human contribution to climate change really very simply. And this is the sort of thing that there's no reason students can't get to grips with this one. This is a pretty simple equation, and have a powerful understanding of the relative contributions to anthropogenic warming. So I don't think there'll be a test on this today, but it's a good equation to learn. And if you put all this together,
that's a great equation. Can I just ask, just to be clear on that equation? That equation is actually has been used, but in calculations by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
I wasn't involved. I think that's right. I wasn't personally involved in SR 1.5, so Miles will be the guy to ask. But I think that has underpinned, from what he said a couple of days ago, I think that has underpinned some aspect of it. But I'm afraid I wasn't on that one. I'm on the next one. Okay, so putting these parts together, the idea of a finite budget consistent with temperature targets worked for long-lived gases. So it works for CO2, for cumulative CO2. It also works for the very long-lived industrial gases, and it works pretty well for nitrous oxide. It doesn't apply to short-lived climate forcings like black carbon or biogenic methane, and that's because these are flow pollutants. And the difference it looks like this. So a lot of the students watching will be geography students and environmental studies students who will know this very well. But for the benefit of those who don't, it's quite common in environmental science to distinguish between flow pollutants, which don't persist in the environment, and stock pollutants, which do. So if you have some emission of some flow pollutant in the first period, then you emit it, and concentrations of that pollutant in the environment go up like that. But because it's a flow pollutant, it decays. So you get to the next period and you emit again, and you get elevated concentrations again, but it decays, and you go again, you emit again, and it decays. So this is a bit like drinking coffee in the morning, where you have your coffee, it elevates the caffeine in your blood. So you drink your coffee, it elevates the caffeine in your blood, but then that breaks down, and then a few hours later you need another coffee. So alcohol, caffeine, other things like that are more or less flow pollutants. And the danger there is drinking too much too quickly, or some peak amount of having too much too fast. But there isn't a binding intertemporal budget. There might be a binding budget for a particular period, but there isn't a binding budget over time. And that contrasts with stock pollutants, where you emit the pollutant and something like lead or mercury in the soil or in your blood, or carbon in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You emit in the first period and concentrations persist. And then you emit in the second period, and the contribution from those emissions persist in the environment, and so on and so on. So in this case, you get linear rise in concentrations, or a steep rise in concentrations with constant emissions. And so the long-lived gases behave like stock pollutants, and the short-lived gases more like flow pollutants. Now, many of them are not perfect flows and not quite perfect stocks, but this distinction is important because it's the stock pollutants that need to get to net zero emissions, whereas the flow pollutants need to decline to make or decline a bit to be consistent with a temperature target. And this is actually reflected in the SR 1.5 report, where with this phrase, this is all that phrase really means: reaching and sustaining net zero global anthropogenic CO2 emissions and declining net non-CO2 radiative forcing would halt anthropogenic global warming. So IPCC are saying the same thing. They're saying you have to get to net zero on the stock pollutants, and you have to have declining net non-CO2 radiative forcing, which is dominated by shorter lived gases than CO2. That together, these would halt the global warming. So when we ask ourselves, what does it take to halt the warming? The answer is we have to stop the emission of stock pollutants, and we have to reduce the emission of flow pollutants.
Just on those flow pollutants, can we just be clear on which ones they are? What are we talking about? The short-lived pollutants. They are, I think, F gases are among them. What else?
Some of them, but not all of them. Anything with a lifetime shorter than about 30 or 40 years would qualify. So the most by radiative forcing, I think the most important one is methane. That's biogenic methane, so from rice, ruminants, and so on. But also things like black carbon, which have a very strong radiative effect, but don't persist for terribly long in the environment. So anything with a short atmospheric residence time, and by short I mean decades rather than centuries.
And just because methane is quite an interesting gas in this respect, can you just elaborate a little bit on why methane is important? Because methane also, of course, it breaks down into carbon dioxide. That's right. In the atmosphere.
Yeah. So if you're emitting fossil methane, then you're introducing new carbon into the atmosphere, and it turns into CO2, so it turns into a stock pollutant. It contributes to the stock of CO2 in the long run, but it has a big kick while it is up there as methane in the first 10, 20, 30 years. And but if you're talking about something like rice production, where what's happening is that you are affixing a carbon atom into the vegetation, and then it's leaving the system as methane, you aren't actually adding to the stock of atmospheric carbon as in CO2, you're just recycling the carbon. But while it is in the form of methane, it has a strong radiative effect. So it has quite a considerable warming component while it is in that state. But because it's a flow pollutant, it's not actually building up the atmospheric CO2. So methane is a good example of the kind of gas that kind of forcing agent that you need to reduce but not get to zero on. And the reason I think methane matters is actually because the countries with the highest fractions of biogenic methane in their emissions portfolio are actually least developed countries and other very poor countries which have much higher much larger agricultural sectors than the rich countries do. So it's a good example. So really, and yeah, I can wrap this up in just a minute, but it'll take two things to end our contribution to global warming. And the main thing is net zero emissions of long-lived gases like CO2. Those are the overwhelmingly predominant sources of radiative forcing. They are what is changing the climate system fastest right now. Historically, they're the main thing, and we need to get to net zero emissions of CO2. But the other thing is declining emissions of short-lived climate drivers like methane. And so the way to look at it in terms of, I think, responsibility perhaps is that there is an intergenerational budget associated with carbon, with CO2, because it's a stock gas. There's only a certain amount you can emit over all times that is consistent with a 2 degree or 1.5 degree target, whereas there is an international but not intergenerational budget for something like methane, because you can emit very or slightly declining amounts over time, but really then it becomes about who's emitting where. And there I think there's a powerful case that the global north should probably take the lead on reducing their emissions of biogenic methane and other short-lived gases to create a little more warming space for people in the global south. But that's moving beyond the physical science, which so moving more into the territory that Fiona will probably cover. So I think that's it from me. Oh, yep, doing both these two things, getting to net zero on the stock gases and declining the flow gases. Doing both these things will halt further warming. So that's what net zero implies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if I could just take you up on just a couple of points there, just before we move on, just to clear them up. You said that carbon dioxide is a stock pollutant in the atmosphere. It persists for, I think you were telling us, 1,000 years at one point. So all of the gas that we started, the carbon dioxide that we started putting into the atmosphere at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, most of that is still there. Is that right? Or a lot of it is still
absolutely. There? Yeah. So about 40% of it is in the atmosphere after 1,000 years, and I think about 25% after 10,000. So we are doing, on geological timescales, driving to the mall is having an effect.
And what about taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere once we've put it there? How do you do that?
Trees can do that, and we'll have Natalie Seddon on this series tomorrow, and there are technological approaches as well, and I see Tim Kruger's also down, so they'll both be terrific on that stuff, which is a little outside my expertise.
But what I'm trying to establish here is this idea that of this absolute limit that we're facing, this absolute carbon budget. You've put that very, very clearly. and it's quite a stark finding, isn't it? I mean, you have really, what your science has established is the parameters that we're working within, quite how much we can emit if we want to stay within a certain amount of warming. And
yes,
can you just, yep.
And those sequestration technologies really matter because of the net. Like if we didn't have those sequestration technologies, it would just be zero. It would be eliminating all emissions. But because those sequestration technologies, which could be trees or air capture plants, because they are a really important part of things, that's why we have the net in there.
So that's where we get the net being the difference between what's emitted and what's reabsorbed.
That's right.
Okay. Great. That's very useful. And then just one other question, which is, how does your research on carbon budgets, how does that fit with our knowledge of sensitivity, which you mentioned earlier? We think that we know that 2 degrees is about the kind of limit of safety, a kind of an important threshold. So that's the other kind of parameter here, isn't it?
Yeah, there are several physical parameters in there that are that kind of matter for it, but it's estimates of the remaining carbon budget or are all informed by things like there's a series of physical parameters: the transient climate response, the transient response to cumulative emissions, the aspects to do with the carbon cycle, and assessments like the IPCCs take the latest science on each of these and turn it into and use them to form those remaining carbon budget estimates.
So if you put together the fact that we want to stay within about 2 degrees because we think that's the degree of sensitivity we can stand, and you put that together with your research, which shows us, how much carbon we can pour into the atmosphere, then effectively what you can do with that is to kind of work backwards and say what we're allowed to put into the atmosphere in the next X years. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
although rather than next X years, we would say across all time. So it just gives you the remaining carbon budget from that entire stock problem.
Okay. That's very useful. Thank you very much. That's great. We'll come back to you with better questions because they'll come from the audience shortly. But we've got, before that, we're going to hear about the rights and wrongs of net zero. We're looking at the legal and ethical case there. And for that, we're hearing from Fiona Yamin, who's an international lawyer who has worked on this for about 20 years. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House, a visiting professor at University College London, and she's a member of the Global Agenda Council on Climate Change at the World Economic Forum. She has served as special advisor to the European Commissioner, Connie Hedegaard. She's been a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and she's given a great deal of advice to various other organizations as well, and including Extinction Rebellion, I think. So, Fiona, if you could tell us about the rights and wrongs, if there are any, of net zero.
No, absolutely, and thank you very much. And I can't see everyone who has joined this call, but want to thank you also for joining today. And I'm, so buoyed to hear that Oxford, which is my home university, activist and academic base that is championing climate action. So that's really, really pleasing to know. I don't have as many of those titles as you said, Fiona, because I think, I'm sorry, that was an old bio, but sort of most recently, I haven't chosen to renew my academic affiliation with UCL, actually, and partly that was born out of frustration of thinking that it was no longer enough to be an academic, that what I was called to do was to be more than an advisor, more than an academic, and as you said, I joined Extinction Rebellion, and a year and a month ago today, I glued myself to the headquarters of Shell in frustration, because I thought it was far more useful for me to do that than to write one more report or to take part in these negotiations. So I'm just giving a little flavour to those who may not know about that side of me, that actually that has been a bigger part of my life for the last almost 2 years, and to support activists and to use my privilege and my position here and my voice and my experience, which is actually since 1991, I've been an advisor to the small island states and submitted the very first protocol that they ever submitted for the first COP in COP1 in Berlin, when Angela Merkel was the environment minister presiding over that COP. So I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I've let my hair go completely grey now to reflect my elder status in life. And I want to just use these few minutes to look back and give you the personal story of net zero and where this comes from, to complement the more scientific version that Dave has so helpfully sort of outlined. So he's very right that, you know, this is actually, oh, you can't see it. There's a weird background thing. Here, yeah. So this is a copy of the convention, and this version is itself 21 years old, and it's falling apart, and I take it everywhere, and it's got the staples of all of the key decisions since then. And the actual first convention I have in a nostalgia box, and I'm hoping that, because I don't have a pension, I can sell it one day on Amazon or eBay or something for lots of money. So I think I've been in this game for a long time, and the convention, I would urge you to read it as a moral document, as a moral and ethical framework, which is what it is. It's also a legal framework, because when this issue of climate change came to the fore, came to the General Assembly, put forward actually by a small island called Malta at the time, back in 1989, you know, it was very much a time when the global south was trying to make itself heard and be present and be an equal partner in shaping the new global order. You know, that's what was happening in the early 90s, actually, with the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, and you had East-West relations, you know, changing, and you also had, you know, the voice of China and India coming forward much more visibly. And the environment was one of the areas where there was a grand bargain struck and a new set of values were formulated. And those new values are embedded in, and they're actually called principles in the Climate Change Convention, and it's Article 3 of the convention. And, you know, we had massive debates during this period, 1991-92, when the convention itself was being negotiated. And essentially, the nub of it is that the convention's moral bedrock, its epistemic moral framework, is grounded in the principle of historic responsibility, of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle that came, you know, very controversial as time went on. But at that time, everyone knew exactly what it meant. It meant that there was a leadership of the richer developed countries, which was actually, you know, who were listed in something called Annex 1, and a smaller set of those richer countries that were the donor countries are listed in Annex 2. They're listed right there. Their moral and financial responsibilities are very clearly and legally spelt out in these annexes. And it essentially lays down a framework which says, if you are a richer polluter country and you cause this problem, you will take the lead in rectifying it, and you will also pay for financial assistance, both for developing countries who polluted less and caused less of the problem, to switch to newer, better technologies, plus you will pay for the cost of adaptation. So there are two financial, you know, elements in there, both what we might now call in today's lingo reparations, a word that would never have been possible then. What the word that we got in as the lawyers to the small islands then is insurance. We actually got the word insurance in, that, you know, rich countries would help provide insurance mechanisms, was closest to compensation as we could get. And we enshrined and structured the legal obligations to reflect this fundamentally moral set of principles, which everybody still to this day shares, and which sadly have not been fulfilled in the letter and spirit in which they were intended. And the reason also why the US then, you know, tried to we negotiated Kyoto, the US didn't agree with Kyoto, the US has now taken itself out of Paris because it fundamentally wants that principle weakened and to not acknowledge the historic nature of the climate debt that is owed to the rest of the world. And as Dave so helpfully pointed out, you know, the present day radiative forcing is largely the result of emissions from the last 300 years. And you can also then put in what is the result of the emissions in the last 10 years. You know, you can track where China starts to play a significant forcing role right now, Brazil, India, and so forth. And all of the scientists from these countries have done those calculations. And by and large, they still have not caught up. So the historic nature of the radiative forcing that you're seeing today, where temperatures stand at 1.1, has a huge moral footprint. And that is what has led, and I think is animating, the demands that we move to a climate justice based approach, that we recognize actually these things that were already, it's not like, you know, we forgot about all of these things. These things were very much debated and part of the moral and ethical and legal framework in all of the 3 treaties that we've negotiated, but in differing ways. As the developed world said, increasingly tries to pass the burden on to China, India, Pakistan, and to the small island states, you know, saying essentially you've got to do your share. And at the same time, just let me finish this point, is, you know, over the last 20 years, you've seen essentially a deindustrialization and an outsourcing of the manufacturing capabilities, and the dirtier industries move to many of the developing countries. You know, garments, textiles, manufacturing, cement, you name it, most of it is done in the powerhouses of other countries. And yet the products that are created, the consumption-based emissions, if we follow that line, still are very disproportionately show that actually it's the demand, it's the consumption and lifestyles and what we used to call in the old days luxury emissions that are driving the emissions of those other countries. So yeah, sorry, Fiona, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I wanted to come in on that point because it strikes me as having a very important resonance at the moment, particularly to talk about the historic responsibility for emissions. And of course, as you pointed out, we just heard about how those emissions are still in the atmosphere. So can we actually measure the historic responsibility of the rich countries which industrialized sooner?
Yeah, I mean, you can argue about what emissions should be included, you know, and in some cases, these countries, my country, India and Pakistan, you know, we were colonized and were not free countries until, you know, 1948. Likewise, large parts of Africa, and even then the economy of those countries continued to be dictated and in some way shaped by that. We can have a big argument about that, but just historically, there's lots and lots and lots of analysis now which show which country emitted what. Or territorial emissions, you know, you can attribute them now and then decide how you want to slice the responsibility. You know, again, why have we got 3 treaties now? You know, a fantastic legal device to evade responsibility is to tear up the treaty which you've failed to comply with and start again, right? That's actually what's happened. That's what's happened.
So you could look at
Kyoto set targets. Kyoto actually had a rigid compliance mechanism, but these are the hardest compliance mechanisms we've been able to put in. And then Paris has absolutely nothing, you know, which would hold states to account for, you know, we're still creating this soft compliance sort of system, you know. So Kyoto itself, which was the best way that we could hold countries to account for, you know, then this model that we had, which was the long-term sort of stabilization goal, working backwards, having a budget and then having 5-year allocations of carbon budgets, which was pioneered by Kyoto, is enshrined in the UK Climate Act. You know, that model also hasn't worked and is part of the history of net zero. So why did net zero come into Paris? And I was, you know, very much a champion of that and created this idea that we should have an absolute cap of some sort. we needed to agree an absolute cap because emissions were going up and there was no legal restraint on anyone. So your emissions could carry on rising. You could just set yourself budgets, great, but there was no hard cap. And the hardest cap that we've got is this combination now actually of 1.5 as the North Star with the simpler, net zero by 2050. And Paris itself doesn't contain 2050. That's what the scientists want, and is still actually a little bit too soft for 1.5. You need a more robust, especially by richer countries. You need to phase out emissions by 2035 to 2045 to take into account your historic debt and to allow some space for other countries. But I think, for the audience that you have here, why was this included is because in law there was absolutely no break, no obligations to reduce emissions. These were soft obligations. So that's why we tried really, really hard to say, you can't keep coming back every 5 years and, having higher and higher targets, or saying, oops, we missed that one, but, we're just going to, on the basis of grandfathering, which is another, very inequitable sort of basis on which to give allocation rights, do that. So that's the history of it. And it was championed by largely the small island countries, by the least developed countries, the smallest emitters, by some of the Latin American countries, a coalition of around 100 countries in the end, at the COP15, which was in Copenhagen in 2009. So almost, like 11 years ago, whatever. And that conference, Fiona, which you will remember, collapsed, and it was meant to agree the successor to Kyoto. So we couldn't agree a successor to Kyoto. And one of the most fundamental reasons for not agreeing the successor to Kyoto at that time, and the final jigsaw that fell into place in that page and a half that we were able to do, is for the very first time, the Climate Change Convention put forward a legal goal of 2 degrees, as being the goal that we would use as a rough metric for climate safety. And these 100 countries with their legal and scientific advisors said, no, we will never put 2 degrees as a safety threshold, as the goal that we're trying to, stay below. We would like to have 1.5. This is in 2009, and it's after the scientific reports of the IPCC come out. The third assessment report and the fourth assessment report come out. So the fight for 1.5, even before you get to Paris, is a decade old. And that is also part of my personal story of why I glue myself to Shell, is because by the time the IPCC 1.5 report comes out, which is mandated by Paris, comes out in October of 2018, I joined Extinction Rebellion in October 2018, and my response was, you know what, we've spent a decade getting reports out sounding the alarm bell, and nothing has worked. And this is why, I'm trying to show the rights and the wrongs of what is, when we debate things in a legal and a scientific and a technical way, we forget actually the scientists have been sounding the alarm. I've had the privilege of being in this scientific process for a decade and a half myself, and shouting very, very loudly. And let me come to then a couple of final points. It's not a debate, and actually it was turned into a debate, as if there were 2 sides for about 15 years. The first 15 years, climate science was a debate, and the TVs and media treated it like some kind of debate. This is fundamentally an issue about power, and the most powerful industries in the whole of human history turned it into a debate and used the media to sow doubt in the minds of the public, used actually disputes about climate science to slow down action. And there were very well funded campaigns, which are now currently the subject of legal investigations and legal cases against, Exxon knew and who knew at the time, that are going through the legal process now, which I hope will bring justice, at least some sense of justice to all of us who worked, showing that there was a deliberate collusion between very powerful interests to suppress, distort, and destroy the science, including the reputations of scientists. And we were deliberately gamed and information was withheld. And that is what happened in the tobacco industry case. And that, I think, will be, and I hope will be shown in the cases that are going forward now. So, you know, that is a side of accountability that I wanted to bring here. It's not in the convention, but actually, you know, why didn't we have net zero emissions? Why didn't we have basically any reduction of emissions? Because basically since 1991, when I started, emissions have increased. We've got this massive COVID-related contraction of the economy, and we had for a brief two to 3 year period, a sort of very heartwarming thing for me personally, when we saw a delinking between, you know, economic growth and emissions in the year 2016 and 2017. We were seeing a decoupling of economic prosperity from emissions, but you know, that rebounded basically, and we have the situation now that, were it not for COVID, with a massive shutdown of the entire global economy, with it looking increasingly worse, we would still have increasing emissions. And we are locking in carbon as I speak. Most of the gigantic bailout money is going to bailing out industries without green conditionalities, without going into the kinds of investments that would really benefit those who are most impacted, which is the poor and vulnerable countries, which is the younger people who will live in now a depressed economy with climate impacts, you know, double whammy, triple whammy, however many whammies you can add up, a huge, huge set of wrongs that are being inflicted. And the law is sort of slowly catching up. You know, we had yesterday, I read in the paper that the Climate Assembly, which was set up by President Macron in France as a result of the protests last year. So protests work, you know, they really do. They can cause, you know, very dramatic change. That Climate Assembly has recommended that there be a law on ecocide, and that should be put to a national referendum. So now that recommendation from the Climate Assembly of France will receive consideration by the president and by the formal legislature in France. But these legal methods and accountabilities and tools, you know, reflect the frustration that is coming through. I want to end on just, you know, I've kind of forgotten how much time I have, but you know, what is now the sort of set of choices? What are the rights and wrongs that we can sort of rectify? So for me, for the last 2.5 years, I've done, and my mantra has been, you know, we got 2050, great, thank you for putting that in there. You know, shame it took you nearly 4 years to implement a simple statutory change, the UK, but you did it, okay, as a result of massive protests, Greta, student strikes. Great, we got there. It's a bittersweet victory, you know, to put it in. And I'm not going to, you know, give great applause to the UK for finally enshrining 3.5 years after Paris what you should have done the year of ratification itself, you know, done all those studies, still very far away from actually implementing policies to be on track under the 4th and 5th carbon budget. So we're way off track in the UK. So our actual implementation doesn't even match what we're going around saying. So 2030 is the new 2050. We have to stop, you know, patting ourselves on the head. It's all about what happens today and tomorrow. And it's what's happening in the budget. It's happening, you know, the fossil fuel subsidies and the hugely unfair and corrupt way in which our financial system works to protect assets of those who are offshored and far away, and perpetuates a system which is now, before COVID, you know, has brought the planet to destruction and has made possible the conditions for COVID, because COVID is a result of us messing up nature. It's a result, direct result of us, you know, taking away the space for nature, not respecting nature to do that. So 2030 is the new 2050. Reparations and repair are the two words that you should talk about. Stop talking about mitigation and adaptation. Two of the most annoying categories. I've done that myself. You know, I feel like they are no longer helpful to see the world in mitigation and adaptation, to have your own expertise and your academic papers in one or the other, which is, again, we were played beautifully. They were posed as opposites. You know, we'll just do mitigation or adaptation. You know, adaptation will take care of the fact that we haven't done enough mitigation. We were supposed to do both, and all of the conventions, all of the treaties that we did, we put in as small islands, as vulnerable countries, the requirements and the financial tools to do both. And then finally, you know, we have to build back better. That's where we are right now. You know, climate is already on the back burner. You know, we've got lock-in and the economy being reshaped before our eyes, and we can't just focus only on an NDC and its revision. Important though that is, what's happening on the ground and on in real life is far more important. And maybe the economy will be structured, my final thought, you know, maybe it won't be reshaped by climate activists, maybe it will be reshaped by the global south, maybe it will be reshaped by Black and brown people. Maybe the movements that will really get change are not led by white middle-class northern NGOs who have talked only about carbon markets, sending the right signal for the last 10 years and have ignored the climate justice lens and have ignored the richness of analysis, the richness of thought leadership. And that is where we are at today. That is exactly where we are today. That is what is happening. And I feel like the optimistic thing I can say to you and the audience is, you know, I do see a blossoming and a thickening of the networks and this sort of phrase, which some people like, some people don't like, you know, movements of coalitions emerging. And I feel that the Generation Z is even more angry and powerful than maybe even the millennials were. So they're on our side, and they're on the side of, and I feel like, you know, us lot, you know, Dave, I don't know how old you are, but our responsibility is to let them lead and to get out of the way and to hear their demand for a much more different world order than the one that we were creating, and accept with a little bit of humility that we didn't get everything right and we got a lot of things wrong. So I'll end it there.
Great, thank you. Well, it is a good moment to talk about historic responsibility. I missed that, so perhaps there will be more listening. We have a question. Our first question is coming from E.J. Fawcett. And for this first question, we're going to take it on Zoom. For the subsequent questions, you've sent them in already, or you're sending them in, and I will read them out. But E.J. Fawcett, you get to ask yours directly.
Thank you, appreciate it. And yes, I definitely agree with what was said about Generation Z being a lot more on it than millennials are. I think we definitely are. So I guess my question to both of our amazing speakers would be, how can we as young people, maybe even Generation Z specifically, help with achieving net zero emissions as a society? What can we do?
If you'd like to take that, Fiona, if you'd like to take that first.
Sure. So I've become far more political. You know, I feel that, you know, analysis and reports and policy work is fantastic and it's really important. But at the same time, we have to be active citizens now and shape our political systems that have really failed us. So being, you know, political and an activist, you know, I always write now, I'm a lawyer and an activist to signal that I'm, you know, I'm happy to compromise my neutrality and my independence. I'm happy to speak from my experience and my truth. So I would say, I would urge you to do that. I also think that it's really wonderful to work locally. That's, again, a massive omission by the climate and environment movement. It's very, very globalized. Actually, it's done too much in the big policy and global spaces. So I'm very proud of something at Camden. I'm the coordinator of Camden Think and Do, and where just last week, Camden has passed its new climate action plan, which commits zero carbon for its Scope 1 direct emissions by 2030, and is working now with the rest of civil society, including groups like My Think and Do, to create citizens-led movements that will tackle behavior change and will tackle those other supply chains. You know, Camden is the heart of London fashion, so we're working on fashion, we're working on car use, we're working on those difficult things that is not the legal responsibility of the council. The council can't do that much unless, you know, people decide voluntarily to give up cars. I also just have like simplified my things into 5 Fs, which is food, so switching to a mainly plant-based diet. Fashion, not buying anything new clothes for the last 2.5 years. I feel I may, you know, do a little bit of that, but it's like actually halting consumption. That's what you were trying to tackle. Finance, you know, looking at your own finances, looking at what you buy. You're a massive consumer. Pensions, your council holds your pension money, they hold your taxes. Your money is the basis of the global financial system, actually. It's very powerful. I think the other one was flights. You know, flights are a massive impact. Obviously, we're all grounded and sort of probably daydreaming about going abroad, but actually, you know, a lot of, to Europe especially, it's accessible. And finally, friendships. You know, we've neglected localizing and building communities, and it's really that is what's going to get you through, frankly, a pretty awful time in the coming 5 years. You know, it's in this country especially, there's some dark times. You know, we're in the deepest depression already for 300 years, and with climate impacts and other impacts coming our way. So I feel, yeah, become an activist, make friendships, work in your community, and above all, be political and be vocal. You know, don't accept a career that is going to compromise you in any way.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I've actually been a climate activist for the past year and a bit now with Oxford Youth Strike Climate, and I just can't agree more with you that young people need to get political and need to make a stand.
Thank you.
I think a couple of things I'll just add are, one is that it's a multi-scale problem, and you can probably bring pressure into the onto the organisations that you interact with, like schools and educational institutes. And you already have agency, and you can, at the moment, it's pretty latent around the world, but I think the school strikes have made a far bigger difference than any other single climate movement I can think of. And the effects have been quite stark here. We did a survey a couple of years ago on local government, and they said the main thing that stopped climate action was lack of, you know, they didn't think it was a priority for their constituents, and now they're signing climate change emergency motions and so on. So things have changed rapidly because of the agency that young people have shown. Another thing I think is, in democracies, the politics has to be strong, but it has to be smart. And I think things like the median voter theorem, understanding that enduring multi-decadal policy is going to take, it has to bring the middle of society with it. So you have to find ways to get people who aren't just other activists, but you have to find a way to help people through those journeys. And finally, supporting climate policy even when it's hard, because I think that the changes we're talking about will require quite a lot of sacrifice, and the temptation to leave it to future people is one we've yielded to far too often already.
Thank you for that. Actually, Dave, I'd like to ask you a question which we've had through. I'm not sure who's asked this one, but someone is asking, why are we just going for net zero? Would it not be better to go for net negative, or in some way trying to restore the climate, which presumably, if we got to net negative, the temperatures would come down to pre-industrial levels? Why don't we go for that?
Yeah, I think, well, they would come down, and that would be a good thing. I think the challenge is that if you leave those ideas on the table, then again, people misinterpret them to mean we don't have to do anything now. People in the future will have these little, you know, controls that mean that they can suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So I think, again, it's a case of intergenerational justice, where we ought to do our bit on getting to zero before we you know, think about going negative.
Thank you. And then related to that, we've got a question that's come online from Kyoto, which is, she just wants to be, we want to be clear here of what are the main contributions that we're talking about. In fact, I'm going to put two questions together here because we've got a question asking, carbon dioxide is the biggest contributor here, isn't it, as opposed to the other gases? So can we just kind of leave the other gases to one side? And the other is what's putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? So what are the activities that we're actually talking about here?
The second question first is fossil fuel combustion is the big one, but there are also land use changes, deforestation are really significant drivers as well of CO2. And I think the way to view CO2 versus other gases is CO2 is a necessary condition of stabilizing temperatures, of ending climate change. So you have to do that if you're going to stop it warming. The other gases are things that it would be good to act on, and there's a lot of opportunities there to do stuff. But the CO2 is the main event.
That's the one we need to tackle. Thank you for that. And Fiona, if I could just turn to you, because we've got a question in from Irene Barriga asking, is social and economic development, getting out of poverty, is that actually possible for developing countries and indeed for the poor and rich countries under net zero?
Absolutely. And I think we now, in 2020, the cleaner and cheapest fuels actually for energy are renewables. And that would be the case. So even now with the distorted energy market where fossil fuels are receiving directly and indirectly trillions in subsidies, so we have a distorted, we don't have a level playing field at the moment. It's highly tipped in favor of fossil fuels because they continue to receive all this money. So right now we have the possibility to massively scale up, and renewable costs have plummeted. Sun, wind, solar, biomass, we've got battery storage and microgrids, and the biggest efficiency gains actually come from building and design. So actually you reduce through the design of your cities and the design of your buildings. First of all, you reduce the demand and then you meet it through renewables. If you continue to build, buildings that require massive air conditioning or require massive heating, you cannot easily meet those needs with technology, although now you can. So this wasn't the case, I would say, 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. Really, the last 10 years have been extraordinary. And that's, again, what has, sorry to go on bang on about it, what drove me to glue myself to Shell is because, report after report, economic analysis after economic analysis by the most authoritative, well-known, respected economists and by people who in finance and industry showing this was ignored, because it's producing evidence isn't just enough. So, the final report that drove me, insane and said, right, this is it. The fossil fuel companies are only investing like 3 to 5% of their capital in cleaner resources. Right, so 110 billion is going with the big oil and gas into, digging up existing reserves of carbon. This is going to change as a result of COVID and many other things. But actually, only 3 to 5%. That's 30 years afterwards is going. And actually, you would think from their marketing and lobbying efforts, which is enormous, they've spent billions since Paris, trying to market themselves as green companies. You would kind of think the fraction was the other way around. So if you drew a pie graph, one tiny sliver of their investment, one segment of an apple, one segment of an orange would be their green investments. And that distorts the entire way in which our financial system also works, because these are these are the same companies that hold our pension funds, that hold up the entire financial structure. We've got, you know, leaders like Canada, we've got leaders like Norway still opening up the Arctic, still opening up tar sands. You know, Canada's budget would use up 17% of the remaining global budget if they carry on with tar sands. This is a country that sells itself as green. So I feel like people need to understand that it's entirely possible, but the stranglehold on our vision and our ability to break up these companies and get them out of the way so that these newer systems can be rapidly scaled up is what's missing.
But that's great, but do we really have time to do that kind of thing? Because one of the questions here, I think it's an excellent question, is about do we need to distance ourselves from moral discussions at this point and instead focus on what can be done, even if the solutions perpetuate injustice? Because there's an argument that, you know, if we've only got the limited carbon budget that we've heard about, that really talking about the carbon debt, the historic responsibility, that's great, but we don't have time for discussions like that because we've only got 10 years, 20 years, you know, 30 years max to get this really sorted out. So if we waste time now by talking about who's responsible for what 100 years ago and who bears the historic responsibility now, then we could be at that. We could be at that for the next decade or more. What we need to do is act now and leave the moral questions behind. Farhana, and then I'll take Dave on this.
I totally hear what you say, and a lot of climate negotiations, you know, have that you know, sense of injustice, of those moral dimensions, and they are there. But I think not seeing the moral better solutions. So what we've done is kind of pretend in the UK that we're a cleaner leader, and actually for the large part there's a third of our emission reductions that's the case, because we switched from coal by, you know, putting 500,000 miners you know, out of jobs without any financial package. We reduced those emissions, we switched to gas, and then actually we outsourced most of our other emissions to other countries. And so the standard of living we have in this country is based on other people, other countries doing that. And we take up a disproportionate share in terms of our lifestyles and continuing that cannot be sustained by the planet. So not looking at the fact that 10% of the global population uses 50% of the budget really obscures actually the better solutions and the more fundamental changes that need to be made, and that must be made and are now possible in this environment. So I would say one of the reasons why we've not got as far is actually we turned climate into a very techno-managerial thing and pretended we could tweak capitalism. Essentially, we pretended we could tweak the carbon market through carbon markets, through a tiny tax. We were going to send a powerful signal through a tiny tax that has absolutely no impact on their behavior. So if you actually look at the scientific evidence, the economic evidence, you know, the carbon markets have failed, carbon taxes have failed. They have not altered the trajectory, the longer term underlying trajectory, and the massive investment flows in the private sphere. They haven't done that, and governments have continued to dole out this money. So you have to look at actually the evidence. The evidence is not moral, it's actually just plain factual that the previous approaches that were techno-managerialist, incrementalist tweaks to a system didn't work. So that's, again, why I feel, okay, I can say that now, because I worked on carbon markets for a decade. Yes, they've delivered a bit of gains. They've created lots more awareness. They sound really cool, but the emissions are like this, aren't they? and they just displaced emissions to other countries. So yeah, let's bring the moral dimension back in. Let's bring the ethical dimension back in. Let's bring science back in. What really works and what failed.
So I guess my perspective,
so morals are fundamental to you, Dave.
Well, I think that we shouldn't expect convergence on moral arguments in a multipolar world. So I think the world's got more complicated as it's as there's more sites of power than there were. The American Pax Americana, which wasn't terribly Pax-like, was probably a simpler world in which to mount arguments. I think there'll be more tensions in a multipolar world, but I also think that that's going to be it's going to be moral arguments are inevitable, and they're a fundamental part of why we're trying to do something about climate change. But I think the way that those are deployed will have to be a bit more subtle in the future. Climate change is no longer a north-south problem. It's a north-south-south problem. A while ago, the rapidly growing, demographically large countries in the G20, but outside the G7, emit more than the global north. That doesn't mean they're more responsible historically. It doesn't mean they have an obligation to do the leadership. It means their emissions matter, and the rest of the world emit substantially less than those countries and the global north. And so I see it as a three-handed problem. And I think that the moral arguments that will persuade those different communities are different in each case, but everybody needs to act because of the net zero constraint. So I think that the type of moral argument needs to change and will change, and it'll need to be a bit more subtle, and it'll need to interface with the emerging political realities around the world. So I think I think it's inevitable that morality plays a strong framing role in this. But I also think that the outcomes are fundamentally decided by political negotiation. So I think the politics is central.
And what we're up against here is not a moral or an abstract limit. It's an actual physical limit that we're talking about in climate change. There are actual physical changes that will take place in the planet if we go beyond these boundaries that you've established. Is that right?
There are arguments about tipping points. The strong versions of those tipping points arguments haven't really persuaded IPCC. Everybody agrees that the warmer it is, the worse it is. But the targets are 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees are politically negotiated targets. It's very difficult to defend the position that something radical happens at 2.01 degrees above pre-industrial, but those play strong framing roles. They're focal points in the negotiation literature or the strategic literature, and they, and the warmer it gets, the worse it gets. So they play a really important role. But I think that exactly where we end up, it's kind of a mix of science, technology, moral persuasion, agency on the behalf of younger generations, and so on. So I think it's a mess, but I think it's unavoidable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, both of you are excellent speakers today for taking us through such complex issues. And setting the scene for where we are in terms of net zero, why we think that net zero is important, why it's been established in science, and why it has a moral and an ethical dimension, and how it's been established in the history of the negotiations over climate change that stretch back for 30 years, and indeed longer. Okay, that's really helped, I think, to set off the first day of our homeschool on net zero. Obviously, we continue through the week, but I'd like to thank our two speakers, and I'd like to hand back to the Oxford Climate Society now, who've got some great news, I think, about a puzzle of the day that you can take part in as well. We didn't get to all the questions today, but as I said, we carry on all week. So there will be a chance to put those questions again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And just to echo that, thanks to both of our speakers. Dave, I just want to mention that, was it the median theory that you mentioned, where, you know, sort of it's not necessarily about tackling school strikers or people who are out there protesting, but also the people in the middle ground. I think that's also incredibly important, and something that we try to do with our events at the Climate Society. And then also Farhana, I think it's really refreshing to hear it from someone of your generation, where there's so many assessments and reports, but from someone of our generation, we just think, when will it perform, right? When will it perform something concrete that we can actually see? So that was incredibly refreshing. And once again, Fiona, thank you for moderating and making things clear for us. So just to sort of segue into our second event and mention it for tomorrow. Tomorrow's event is called Pathways to Net Zero with Ambuj Sagar from the India Institute for Technology, and also Steve Smith from the University of Oxford. They'll basically be outlining the different ways in which we can get to net zero through policy and also concrete action. We've also been in touch with BBC Radio 4 to inform their puzzle of the day tomorrow morning, which has been informed by today's session. So I don't know how many of you are early risers, but if you can get up at 6:50 or 7 a.m., the puzzle of the day will be mentioned there. And just lastly to say, if you've enjoyed and learned something from today's webinar, then please do share around with your friends and schools so that more people can benefit from the homeschool that we're creating for you today. Thanks to our speakers once again, and for taking the time out for this event. And thanks to those of you who are watching, and we hope to see you tomorrow. So we're going to end the live stream now. Speakers, if I could just ask you to stay on the live stream, and we'll just end it now.